The distant howl of a lone wolf echoed across the vast Wyoming landscape as Grace Fairfield clutched her tattered carpetbag tighter, squinting at the weathered wooden sign that read, Winnetka population 342. The year was 1876, and Grace had traveled over 1,000 miles to escape memories as harsh as the frontier winter, hoping this remote town would be far enough from her past. Just a bit further, she whispered to herself, tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear as the stagecoach that had dropped her at the town's edge disappeared in a cloud of dust. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the main street, where weathered storefronts and saloons lined both sides like sentinels of civilization in the wilderness. Her emerald eyes surveyed her new home, a place she'd chosen from a newspaper advertisement seeking a schoolteacher, a position that promised a small cabin and enough distance from Philadelphia to help her forget. The journey had taken every penny she had, and exhaustion pulled at her like quicksand. Grace adjusted her simple blue dress, now wrinkled from days of travel, and made her way toward what appeared to be the town's only hotel. Inside the modest establishment, a gray-haired woman looked up from behind a wooden counter. "You must be the new schoolteacher," she said, her face crinkling into a smile. "Mayor's been expecting you." "Yes, madam. Grace Fairfield." She extended her hand, aware of how city-soft it still looked compared to the weathered hands of the woman before her. "Alma Jenkins. My husband and I run this place." Alma pushed a ledger across the counter. "Mayor said to put you up for the night. Tomorrow he'll show you to your cabin." Grace signed her name with a trembling hand, partly from exhaustion, partly from the enormity of what she'd done. Leaving everything familiar behind to teach in a town she'd never seen before had seemed brave in Philadelphia. Now it felt like madness. "Supper's at 6, Alma said, handing her a key. "Room 3, top of the stairs. It ain't fancy, but it's clean." The room was indeed simple, a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a porcelain basin, and a small window overlooking the main street. Grace set her carpetbag on the bed and allowed herself a moment to close her eyes. 22 years old and starting over. The weight of why she'd fled Philadelphia pressed against her chest, the scandal, the whispers, the broken engagement. She pushed the memories away, focusing instead on unpacking the few possessions she'd brought with her. Among them was a small photograph of her parents, both gone now, and several beloved books she couldn't bear to leave behind. Teaching had been her salvation in Philadelphia, and she prayed it would be her future here as well. After washing away the dust of travel as best she could, Grace made her way downstairs for the promised meal. The dining room held only a few tables, most empty save for an elderly man reading a newspaper and a young couple speaking in hushed tones. "Miss Fairfield, come join me." A booming voice drew her attention to a portly man rising from a corner table. "Walter Campbell, town mayor." He extended a meaty hand. "Glad you made it safe and sound." Grace shook his hand, noticing his well-tailored suit that seemed out of place in this frontier setting. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mayor Campbell. Call me Walter. We don't stand on ceremony much here." He gestured for her to sit. "Hope your journey wasn't too taxing." "It was." "Educational," she replied diplomatically, not wanting to dwell on the discomforts of 3 days on various stage coaches. Walter chuckled. "That's one way to put it. Now, school starts next Monday. That gives you a few days to settle in and prepare. We've got about 30 children of various ages waiting for some book learning." As they discussed the details of her position, Grace felt some of her anxiety ebb. The salary was modest, but included the cabin and provisions. The school itself was a single room attached to the church, with benches and slates for the children. Most folks here are decent, Walter continued, cutting into the steak Alma had placed before them. Ranchers, shopkeepers, a few miners. Everyone's been looking forward to having a proper teacher again. Last one left us 6 months ago to get married. Grace nodded, wondering if she should mention that there would be no risk of that happening with her. After Jonathan's betrayal, she had sworn off any romantic entanglements. "I'm fully committed to the children's education," she said instead. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion at the hotel entrance. A tall figure filled the doorway, silhouetted against the dying light outside. As he stepped into the lamplight, Grace saw a man in his early 30s, broad-shouldered and weathered, with a young boy of perhaps 5 or 6 years clutching his hand. "Mayor," the man nodded, his voice deep and rough like gravel. "Sorry to interrupt." Billy here was insistent on coming to town for supplies today instead of waiting till Saturday. "Mitchell Logan." Walter's face broke into a grin. "No apologies needed. Come meet our new school teacher, Miss Fairfield." Grace found herself looking into the most piercing blue eyes she'd ever seen, set in a face browned by sun and marked by a life lived outdoors. A scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into several days' worth of stubble. His dark hair curled slightly at the edges of his battered hat. "Madam," he said simply, tipping his hat with his free hand. "Mr. Logan," she replied, her voice steadier than she expected. The boy beside him stared at her openly, his own blue eyes a perfect match to his father's wide with curiosity. His small face was smudged with dirt, but his clothing, though well worn, was clean. "This here's my son, Billy," Mitchell said, placing a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "He'll be one of your students come Monday." Billy continued to stare, then blurted out, "You're pretty." "Are you an angel?" Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks as Mitchell Logan cleared his throat. "Billy, that's not a proper way to greet someone. But Pa, she looks like the picture in your Bible, the one of Mama." An awkward silence fell over the table. Grace saw the man's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Apologize to Miss Fairfield," Mitchell said quietly. "I'm sorry," Billy mumbled, looking down at his scuffed boots. "No apology needed," Grace assured him with a gentle smile. "Thank you for the kind words, Billy." Walter, seeming eager to dispel the tension, gestured to empty chairs at their table. "Join us, Mitch. Alma's stew is especially good tonight." Mitchell hesitated, then nodded. "Much obliged, but we can't stay long. Still got a good hour's ride back to the ranch and daylight's fading." As they settled into chairs, Grace couldn't help but notice how Mitchell Logan moved with the fluid grace of a man completely at home in his body, despite his size. His hands were calloused and strong, a working man's hands, yet he handled his cutlery with unexpected gentleness when Alma brought bowls of stew. "Miss Fairfield comes to us all the way from Philadelphia," Walter offered, clearly trying to spark conversation. "That's a long way," Mitchell observed, glancing at her. "What brings you out to these parts?" "A desire for adventure," she replied, the lie coming easily after so many rehearsals. "And the opportunity to teach, of course." Something in his eyes suggested he didn't quite believe her, but he didn't press. Instead, he focused on helping his son manage his spoon without spilling. Billy, however, had no such reservations about direct questions. "Where's your husband?" he asked between mouthfuls. "Billy," Mitchell warned. "I don't have one," Grace answered honestly, seeing no reason to lie to a child. "I'm not married." Billy seemed to consider this information carefully. "Pa isn't married neither. Not anymore." His voice dropped to what he clearly thought was a whisper but carried easily in the quiet dining room. "Mama's in heaven. She died when I was real little." Grace's heart constricted at the matter-of-fact way the child stated his loss. "I'm very sorry to hear that," she said softly, watching Mitchell's face close like a shutter. 3 years ago, Mitchell said simply, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of conversation. Fever took her. Walter, sensing the growing discomfort, launched into a detailed explanation of the upcoming Founders' Day celebration, allowing Mitchell and Grace to retreat into silence. As the meal concluded, Mitchell rose, placing a few coins on the table. "We should head back. Billy, say goodbye to Miss Fairfield and the mayor." Billy stood and made a small bow that someone had clearly taught him. "Goodbye, Miss Fairfield. Will you tell us stories at school?" "My pa tells the best stories, but he says I need to learn reading too." Grace couldn't help but smile at his earnestness. "Yes, there will definitely be stories, Billy, and I look forward to teaching you to read your own." The boy's face lit up with a smile that transformed him, revealing a missing front tooth. "I'd like that." Mitchell extended his hand to Grace. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Miss Fairfield. I'm sure Billy will learn a great deal under your guidance." As their hands touched briefly, Grace felt a strange flicker of something awareness, perhaps that she quickly dismissed. "Thank you, Mr. Logan. I'll do my best with all my students." She watched as father and son left the hotel, the tall man adjusting his stride to match his son's shorter legs, their silhouettes merging with the gathering darkness outside. "Fine man, Mitchell Logan," Walter commented, pulling her attention back. "One of the hardest working ranchers in these parts. Built that spread of his from nothing and keeps it going despite everything." "Everything?" Grace couldn't help asking. Walter's expression grew solemn. "Lost his wife Sarah when Billy was just turned 3. Pneumonia took her quick. Mitchell nearly worked himself to death afterward, trying to keep the ranch going and raise that boy alone." He shook his head. "Proud man. Wouldn't accept help even when he clearly needed it." Grace thought of the guarded blue eyes and the protective way Mitchell had placed his hand on his son's shoulder. "The boy seems well cared for." "Oh, Mitch is a good father, no doubt about that. Man would lay down his life for that boy." Walter sighed. "Just worried sometimes that Billy's missing things a mother would provide. Mitchell's sister Rebecca comes up from Denver when she can, but it's not the same." Grace nodded, understanding all too well what it meant to grow up with a piece of yourself missing. Her own mother had died when she was 12, leaving her father to raise her alone until his heart gave out 4 years ago. The next few days passed in a blur as Grace settled into her small cabin at the edge of town. It was simple but sturdy, with a main room that served as kitchen and living area, and a small bedroom with a narrow bed and chest of drawers. A covered porch faced west, offering spectacular sunset views over the distant mountains. She spent hours preparing the schoolhouse, cleaning away months of dust and arranging the few books and supplies available. The community had gathered basic materials: slates, chalk, a few tattered readers, but Grace supplemented with books from her own collection. On Sunday, she attended services at the small white church where most of the town gathered. Seated in a back pew, she observed her new neighbors and future students. Mitchell and Billy Logan sat several rows ahead, the boy fidgeting until his father placed a gentle hand on his knee. Grace noticed how many people, particularly women, made a point of greeting Mitchell, some lingering longer than seemed necessary. A tall rancher with graying temples seemed especially attentive to Mitchell, clapping him on the shoulder and engaging him in extended conversation while his wife fussed over Billy. After the service, Grace found herself surrounded by curious townspeople eager to meet the new teacher. Parents introduced children who stared up at her with expressions ranging from excitement to trepidation. Through it all, she maintained her composure, smiling and shaking hands until her cheeks ached and her fingers were numb. "Quite a welcome committee," came a familiar deep voice from behind her. She turned to find Mitchell Logan standing there, hat in hand, with Billy peeking around his leg. "Indeed," she agreed. "Everyone has been very kind. Folks here appreciate having a teacher. Means a lot to have someone willing to come all this way to educate the children." His eyes studied her with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she held his gaze. "Education is important," she said simply. "Every child deserves the chance to learn." "Yes, madam, they do." Something in his expression softened slightly. "Billy's been talking of nothing else but starting school tomorrow." The boy in question tugged at his father's hand. "Can I show Miss Fairfield my horse, Pa, please?" Mitchell looked apologetic. "Billy's got a new pony, first one of his own. He's mighty proud." "I'd be delighted to see your horse, Billy," Grace said, genuinely touched by the child's eagerness to share something important to him. They walked to the hitching post where several horses stood patiently in the shade. Billy ran ahead to a small dun-colored pony with a black mane. "This is Butterscotch," he announced proudly. "Pa gave him to me for my birthday last month. I'm 6 now," he added importantly. "He's beautiful," Grace said, admiring the gentle-looking animal, "and a very fine name." "He likes butterscotch candy same as me," Billy explained seriously. "That's why I named him that." Mitchell watched his son with quiet pride. "He's learning to care for him himself, brushing, feeding, even helping with the stable cleaning." "Very impressive," Grace said, meaning it. "That's a lot of responsibility for someone your age, Billy." The boy stood taller at her praise. "Pa says a man has to learn responsibility young." "Your father is wise," she said, catching Mitchell's eye briefly. Something unspoken passed between them, recognition, perhaps, of the value they both placed on teaching children not just facts, but character. The moment was broken when Billy suddenly asked, "Will you come have dinner with us sometime, Miss Fairfield? Pa makes real good beans, and I can show you my room and all my toys." Mitchell's face flushed slightly. "Billy, Miss Fairfield probably has other plans. I'd like that very much, Billy," Grace interrupted gently. "But only if your father extends the invitation properly." Mitchell looked at her with surprise, then a hint of what might have been respect. "You'd be welcome at the Circle L anytime, Miss Fairfield, though I should warn you my cooking is basic at best." "I'm sure it's wonderful," she replied with a small smile. "And please call me Grace." He nodded slowly. "Grace, then, and I'm Mitchell to my friends, Mitch to most." "Pa says we'll be in school all day tomorrow," Billy interjected, clearly wanting to maintain his place in the conversation. "Will we really?" Grace laughed, a genuine sound that she realized had been absent from her life for too long. "Well, from 9 until 3, with breaks, of course." "That's practically forever," Billy sighed dramatically. "You'll survive," Mitchell assured him, ruffling his hair affectionately. "We should head back to the ranch. Got chores waiting." As they prepared to leave, Billy surprised Grace by throwing his arms around her waist in a quick hug. "I'm glad you're our teacher," he said, then dashed back to his father's side. Mitchell nodded to her, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Until tomorrow, Grace." As she watched them ride away, the tall man and the small boy on his pony, Grace felt something inside her shift slightly. For the first time since arriving in Winnetka, she felt like perhaps she had made the right decision after all. The first day of school dawned clear and bright. Grace arrived early, arranging books and writing the date September 18, 1876, on the small blackboard. Her heart raced with a mixture of anxiety and excitement as she smoothed her crisp white blouse and brushed invisible dust from her dark skirt. This was familiar territory, she reminded herself. Teaching was something she knew how to do. The children began arriving in groups, some on foot from town, others on horseback or in wagons from outlying farms and ranches. Grace welcomed each one, assigning seats based on age and, as best she could guess, ability. By 9 o'clock, 27 students ranging from 5 to 16 years old filled the benches, watching her with expressions ranging from curious to bored. Billy Logan arrived with his father, bouncing with excitement. He proudly presented Grace with a shiny red apple. "Pa says teachers like apples," he explained seriously. "This teacher certainly does," Grace confirmed, accepting the gift with appropriate solemnity. "Thank you, Billy." Mitchell lingered at the back of the room, hat in hand, watching as Billy found his seat among the younger children. "He's been up since before dawn," he said quietly when Grace approached. "Couldn't wait to start." "That enthusiasm will serve him well," she replied. Mitchell nodded, then glanced around the room. "Quite a range of ages you're dealing with. It's common in rural schools." "I'll group them by ability for different subjects." She offered him a reassuring smile. "I've taught in similar situations before." Something in his expression suggested he wanted to ask more about her background, but he merely nodded again. "Well, I'll leave you to it then." He turned to go, then paused. "That invitation stands. For supper at the ranch. Maybe this Saturday if you're free." Grace hesitated only briefly. "Saturday would be lovely, thank you." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "I'll send the wagon for you around 4 then." He touched his hat in farewell and strode from the schoolhouse. The day passed in a whirlwind as Grace assessed her students' various levels, established rules, and began basic lessons. Billy proved to be bright and eager, though easily distracted. By the final bell, her voice was hoarse and her feet ached, but she felt a deep satisfaction at having successfully navigated her first day. As the children filed out, Billy lingered, helping her erase the blackboard without being asked. "Did I do good today, Miss Fairfield?" he asked anxiously. "You did very well, Billy," she assured him. "I'm particularly impressed with your numbers." His chest puffed with pride. "Pa taught me counting, for the cattle and such." "Well, he did an excellent job." She helped him into his jacket. "Is your father picking you up?" Billy shook his head. "I'm supposed to go to Mrs. Henderson's store after school. Pa's coming to town later to get me." "Then I'll walk you there," Grace offered, gathering her materials. They were halfway to the general store when a commotion erupted from the saloon across the street. A man staggered out, clearly drunk despite the early hour, shouting obscenities. Grace instinctively moved Billy behind her, but the man had already spotted them. "Well, if it ain't the fancy new schoolmarm," he slurred, weaving toward them. "Heard you was a pretty one." "Sir, please go about your business," Grace said firmly, her heart pounding as she maintained a protective stance in front of Billy. "My business might just be getting to know you better," the man leered, coming closer. His unshaven face and bloodshot eyes made Grace's skin crawl, but she stood her ground. "That's quite enough, Harlan," came a stern female voice. Mrs. Henderson, a formidable woman in her 50s, emerged from her store with a broom in hand. "You go sleep it off before Sheriff Brady throws you in a cell again." The drunk man spat on the ground but seemed unwilling to challenge Mrs. Henderson. With a final glare at Grace, he staggered back toward the saloon. "Thank you," Grace said to Mrs. Henderson, feeling Billy's small hand slip into hers. "Don't mention it. That's just Harlan Wells' more bluster than bite, but best give him a wide berth when he's in his cups." The older woman smiled at Billy. "Come on in, young man. Got some fresh candy sticks today." Inside the store, Billy quickly recovered from the encounter, his attention captured by the promised sweets. Grace was still shaken, but hid it well, chatting with Mrs. Henderson about the school day while Billy carefully selected a peppermint stick. "That was very brave of you," came a deep voice from the doorway. Mitchell Logan stood there, his expression dark as he glanced in the direction of the saloon. "Mr. Logan," Mrs. Henderson greeted him, You've got a fine helper here. Billy's been organizing my penny nail bins." Mitchell's face softened as he looked at his son, who was indeed meticulously sorting nails by size. He likes things in their proper place, gets that from his mother. He turned back to Grace. "Mrs. Henderson tells me you had a run-in with Harlan Wells." "It was nothing," Grace assured him. "Mrs. Henderson handled it admirably. Still, I don't like the idea of him bothering you." His jaw tightened. "Man's been trouble since he lost his land to the bank last year." "Pa, look," Billy interrupted, holding up his candy stick. "Miss Fairfield walked me here after school. She's not scared of nothing, just like you said a teacher should be." Mitchell's eyes met Grace's over his son's head. "Is that so?" "I wouldn't go that far," Grace demurred. "But I do believe in setting an example of composure for the children." "Well, I appreciate you looking out for him." Mitchell's voice was gruff, but sincere. They left the store together, Billy chattering about his school day between licks of his candy. As they reached the hitching post where Mitchell's horse waited, Grace prepared to say goodbye. "I should get back to the schoolhouse. I have preparations for tomorrow." "Allow me to escort you," Mitchell offered, his tone making it clear this wasn't really a request. "After that incident with Wells, I'd feel better knowing you got back safely." Grace wanted to protest that she was perfectly capable of walking the short distance alone, but something in his expression stopped her. "That's very kind of you." Mitchell lifted Billy onto his horse, then took the reins and walked beside Grace. Billy, perched happily in the saddle, continued his animated description of the day's events. "And then Miss Fairfield let me help pass out the slates, Pa. And I wrote my whole name, all of it. William Mitchell Logan," Mitchell confirmed with pride. "That's impressive, son." "Miss Fairfield says I'm a natural with numbers," Billy added. "Just like you taught me, Pa." Mitchell glanced at Grace. "He's always been quick with figures, useful skill on a ranch." "It will serve him well in many ways," Grace agreed. "He's very bright and eager to please, which makes teaching him a joy." A comfortable silence fell between them as they walked, broken only by Billy's occasional observations about things they passed. When they reached the schoolhouse, Grace turned to thank them. "See you tomorrow, Miss Fairfield." Billy called from atop the horse. "I look forward to it, Billy," she replied with a warm smile. Mitchell held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. "Until Saturday, then." "Yes, Saturday," she confirmed, feeling a flutter of something she couldn't quite name. As they rode away, Grace stood watching until they disappeared around a bend in the road. She told herself the warm feeling in her chest was simply satisfaction with her first successful day of teaching, nothing more. The remainder of the week passed in a blur of lessons, getting to know her students and settling into the rhythms of Winnetka. By Friday afternoon, Grace had established a routine that seemed to work for the wide range of ages and abilities under her care. The older students helped with the younger ones, and she rotated between groups throughout the day. Billy Logan continued to shine, his natural intelligence and enthusiasm making him a pleasure to teach. He often stayed after school to help clean up, chatting about life on the ranch and peppering Grace with questions about Philadelphia and the world beyond Wyoming. "Is it true there are buildings taller than trees in the city?" he asked one afternoon as they wiped down slates. "Some are quite tall," Grace confirmed, 5 or 6 stories high. Billy's eyes widened. "Pa says we might go to Cheyenne someday. That's a city too, right?" "Yes, though smaller than Philadelphia." "Have you ever been on a train, Miss Fairfield?" "Several times," she said, remembering her journey west, the parts of it she'd made by rail before switching to stage coaches. Billy sighed dreamily. "I want to ride a train someday and see the ocean. Pa's seen the ocean when he was younger, says it goes on forever, farther than you can see." Grace smiled at his wonder. It does seem that way. Why'd you leave the city to come here? Billy asked suddenly with a child's directness. Don't you miss your family? The question caught her off guard. My parents are gone, she said after a moment. And I wanted adventure, like I told you before. Billy nodded sagely. Pa says sometimes people need to start fresh. That's why he came out here from Missouri after the war. Grace realized how little she knew about Mitchell Logan's past. Your father fought in the war, Billy nodded proudly. For the Union. He doesn't talk about it much, but Uncle James, that's his best friend, he says Pa was real brave. Before Grace could process this new information, the door opened and Mitchell himself appeared. Hope I'm not interrupting, he said, filling the doorway with his tall frame. Thought I'd save you the walk to town, Billy. Pa, Miss Fairfield's been to Philadelphia and ridden on trains, Billy announced excitedly. Mitchell's eyes crinkled at the corners. Has she now? Sounds like you've been pestering her with questions again. I don't mind, Grace assured him. His curiosity is refreshing. Still, don't want to wear out our welcome before tomorrow. Mitchell's gaze met hers. You're still planning to join us, of course. I'm looking forward to it. The words were true, Grace realized with mild surprise. Despite her initial reservations about forming connections in Winnetka, she found herself genuinely anticipating the visit to the Logan Ranch. Good. I'll have the wagon come for you around 4. Mitchell helped Billy into his coat. Say goodbye to Miss Fairfield, son. Goodbye, Miss Fairfield. Billy chirped, wrapping his arms around her waist in what had become a customary hug. See you tomorrow. As they left, Grace found herself wondering about Mitchell Logan's past. A Union soldier who'd come west after the war, now raising his son alone on a Wyoming ranch. There was clearly more to the quiet rancher than met the eye. Saturday dawned clear and cool, with a hint of autumn crispness in the air. Grace spent the morning grading papers and planning the next week's lessons, then devoted the afternoon to personal preparations. She washed her hair and pinned it in a simpler style than her usual school day knot, leaving a few curls loose around her face. After deliberating longer than she cared to admit, she chose a dress of soft blue cotton nicer than her teaching clothes, but not so formal as to seem pretentious for a ranch supper. At precisely 4 o'clock, a wagon pulled up outside her cabin. To her surprise, Mitchell himself sat in the driver's seat, with Billy bouncing excitedly beside him. We came to get you ourselves, Billy announced as Grace approached. Pa said it was the proper thing to do. Mitchell offered her his hand to help her up. Hope you don't mind the bumpy ride. Roads a bit rough in places. His hand was warm and strong, engulfing hers completely. Grace felt that same strange flutter as their eyes met briefly. Not at all. I'm looking forward to seeing your ranch. The journey took about 40 minutes, following the main road out of town, before turning onto a narrower track that wound through rolling grassland. Billy kept up a steady stream of commentary, pointing out landmarks and sharing ranch knowledge with the seriousness of a tour guide. That's Thompson Creek, he explained as they crossed a small bridge. It runs right through our property. Pa says it's why our grass grows so good for the cattle. As they crested a gentle rise, the Circle L Ranch came into view. A sturdy 2-story house of weathered wood stood in a clearing, with a large barn and several outbuildings nearby. A corral held several horses, and in the distance, cattle dotted the hillsides. It's beautiful, Grace said sincerely, taking in the peaceful scene. Mitchell seemed pleased by her reaction. It's not much compared to what you're used to, I expect, but it suits us. It's exactly what I imagined a proper ranch would be, she assured him. As they pulled up to the house, Grace noticed the freshly swept porch and the pot of late-blooming wildflowers by the door. Someone had made an effort to make the place welcoming. Come on, Billy urged, jumping down from the wagon and reaching for her hand. "I want to show you everything." Mitchell laughed, a rich sound Grace realized she'd rarely heard from him. "Slow down, son. Miss Fairfield just arrived. At least let her catch her breath." But Grace was already being tugged toward the barn by an insistent Billy. "It's fine," she called over her shoulder to Mitchell. "I'd love the tour." For the next half hour, Billy showed her the entire ranch, the barn with its horses and Mitchell's prize bull in a separate pen, the chicken coop where he proudly collected an egg to show her, the vegetable garden now mostly harvested for winter, and finally the small family graveyard on a hill overlooking the house. "That's where Mama is," Billy said matter-of-factly, pointing to a well-tended grave marked by a simple wooden cross. "Pa says she can see the whole ranch from up here and watch over us." Grace's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. "That's a lovely thought. You think it's true?" Billy asked, looking up at her with trust in his blue eyes. Grace chose her words carefully. "I think the people we love are always with us in some way, even when we can't see them." Billy considered this seriously, then nodded. "That's what Pa says too, but sometimes he gets sad anyway." Before Grace could respond, Mitchell's voice called from below. "Supper's almost ready. You two better come wash up." Inside, the Logan home was simple but comfortable. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a solid table, several chairs, and a stone fireplace. Shelves held books more than Grace would have expected, and a few carefully preserved photographs. Everything was tidy, if showing signs of bachelor living. "Something smells wonderful," Grace commented as Mitchell stirred a pot on the cast iron stove. "Pa makes the best stew," Billy informed her, pulling out a chair at the table. "With real potatoes and carrots from our garden." Mitchell looked almost embarrassed. "It's nothing fancy, just a simple beef stew and biscuits." "Sounds perfect to me," Grace assured him, genuinely touched by his efforts. During the meal, conversation flowed more easily than Grace had anticipated. Billy dominated much of it, but Mitchell gradually opened up, sharing stories about ranch life and asking thoughtful questions about her teaching methods. "Billy's reading has improved noticeably already," he commented as they finished the surprisingly delicious stew. "Been practicing every night with that primer you sent home." "He's a quick study," Grace replied, "and clearly has a good teacher at home as well." Mitchell's eyes met hers across the table. "Had a good education myself before the war. My father believed in learning even if we were just going to be ranchers." "Pa knows everything," Billy declared loyally. "He reads to me every night, even the hard books." Mitchell's cheeks colored slightly. "Not everything, son, but I try to remember what I can." After supper, Billy insisted on showing Grace his room upstairs, a small but cozy space with a handmade quilt on the bed and a shelf of treasured possessions ranging from interesting rocks to a carved wooden horse. "Pa made this for me," he said proudly, showing her the carving. "He makes lots of things in winter when the snow's too deep for regular ranch work." When they returned downstairs, Mitchell had cleared the table and was pouring coffee. "Billy, time for your bath before bed." The boy looked ready to protest, but Mitchell raised an eyebrow in a way that clearly brooked no argument. With a dramatic sigh, Billy headed to where a metal tub stood ready near the kitchen stove. "I can take my leave if it's bath time," Grace offered, not wanting to intrude on their routine. "No need," Mitchell assured her. "Unless you'd rather get back to town, the light will hold for another hour or so." "I'm in no rush," she said truthfully. While Billy bathed behind a screen in the kitchen area, Grace and Mitchell sat by the fire with their coffee. "Thank you for inviting me," Grace said. "It's been a lovely evening." Mitchell studied her over the rim of his cup. "Billy's taken quite a shine to you, All he talks about is school and Miss Fairfield this, Miss Fairfield that. He's a wonderful child. You've done an amazing job raising him, especially under the circumstances. A shadow crossed Mitchell's face. Do my best. Not always sure it's enough. From what I've seen, it's more than enough, Grace said softly. He's kind, curious, respectful, all signs of excellent parenting. Mitchell looked into the fire. Sarah, my wife, she had all these plans for him. Reading lessons, music even. Wanted him to have opportunities we didn't have growing up during the war. He fell silent for a moment. Sometimes I wonder if I'm honoring what she would have wanted. The vulnerability in his admission touched Grace deeply. I think any mother would be proud of the boy Billy is becoming. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of shared values. The moment was broken when Billy emerged from behind the screen in his nightshirt, hair still damp. All clean, he announced, coming to stand by his father's chair. Can Miss Fairfield read me my bedtime story tonight? Mitchell looked to Grace, raising an eyebrow in question. I'd be honored, she replied, touched by the request. Upstairs, Billy settled into his bed while Grace sat beside him with the book he'd selected, a collection of folk tales she recognized from her own childhood. This was one of my favorites too, she told him, opening to the story of Jack and the Beanstalk. Billy listened with rapt attention, asking questions about giants and magic beans that Grace answered patiently. As the story concluded, his eyelids grew heavy. Miss Fairfield, he murmured sleepily, you tell stories almost as good as Pa. That's high praise indeed, she smiled, adjusting his blanket. I like having you here, he continued, fighting sleep. It's nice. Like having he yawned hugely. Like having what, Billy? Grace prompted gently. Billy's eyes fluttered closed. Like having a mama, he whispered, already half asleep. Grace sat frozen, her heart suddenly aching with an emotion she couldn't name. She gently brushed Billy's hair back from his forehead, watching as his breathing deepened into sleep. When she returned downstairs, Mitchell was standing by the fireplace, staring into the flames. He's asleep, Grace said softly. The story worked its magic. Mitchell turned, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He always fights sleep, afraid he'll miss something. A comfortable silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Grace found herself noticing details about Mitchell she hadn't before, the way firelight caught the hints of gold in his dark hair, the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter as well as hardship. I should probably get you back to town before it gets too late, he said finally, though he made no move toward the door. Yes, I suppose so, Grace agreed, equally reluctant to end the evening. Outside, the sky had darkened to deep indigo, stars appearing like diamonds scattered across the heavens. The air had cooled considerably, and Grace shivered slightly in her light dress. Here, Mitchell said, shrugging out of his jacket and draping it around her shoulders before she could protest. The wool was warm from his body and carried the scent of him, leather, soap, and something uniquely masculine. Thank you, she murmured, pulled it closer despite herself. The ride back to town was quieter without Billy's chatter, but the silence between them felt comfortable rather than awkward. Mitchell occasionally pointed out constellations overhead or landmarks barely visible in the moonlight. As they approached her cabin, Grace found herself wishing the journey were longer. Mitchell brought the wagon to a stop and came around to help her down, his hand strong at her waist as he lifted her effortlessly to the ground. Thank you for coming, he said, his voice low in the darkness. It meant a lot to Billy. And to me, he added after a slight hesitation. I enjoyed every minute, Grace replied honestly, looking up at him. In the moonlight, his features seemed softer somehow, the habitual guardedness momentarily absent, Neither seemed willing to break the moment until Mitchell finally cleared his throat. "Would you? That is, Billy and I would be honored if you'd join us for Sunday dinner after church tomorrow. If you don't have other plans." Grace smiled, warmed by the invitation. "I'd like that very much." His answering smile transformed his face, making him look younger and unburdened. "Good, that's good." As he helped her to her door, his hand brushed hers, perhaps accidentally, perhaps not. The brief contact sent a jolt through Grace that both alarmed and excited her. "Good night, Mitchell," she said, reluctantly slipping his jacket from her shoulders and returning it to him. "Good night, Grace," he replied, his voice wrapping around her name like a caress. She watched from her doorway as he drove away, wondering at the fluttering in her chest and the warmth in her cheeks. This was dangerous territory. She knew developing feelings for anyone in her new life hadn't been part of her plan. And yet, something about Mitchell Logan and his son had already breached the careful walls she'd built around her heart. The next few weeks established a pattern that became precious to Grace. Sundays with the Logans after church, occasional Saturday visits to the ranch, and Billy's daily presence in her classroom brought a richness to her life she hadn't expected to find in Winnetka. October painted the landscape in gold and crimson as autumn took hold. The school thrived under Grace's guidance, with even the most reluctant students showing improvement. Parents expressed their appreciation at a harvest festival held in the town square, where Grace found herself surrounded by grateful mothers bearing pies and preserves as gifts. "You've worked miracles with my Josephine," Mrs. Whitman declared, pressing a jar of pickled beets into Grace's hands. "Girl couldn't string 3 words together on paper before, and now she's writing whole compositions." "Josephine has a natural talent," Grace deflected. "She just needed encouragement." Mitchell stood nearby, smiling slightly as he watched the women flock around her. When their eyes met across the crowd, something warm and private passed between them, a connection that had been growing steadily since that first dinner at the ranch. Later, as townspeople danced to fiddle music in the square, Mitchell approached her. "May I have this dance, Miss Fairfield?" he asked formally, though his eyes held a hint of mischief. "I'd be delighted, Mr. Logan," she replied, placing her hand in his. As he led her into the circle of dancers, Grace felt the eyes of the town upon them but found she didn't care. Mitchell's hand at her waist was steady and sure as they moved through the steps of the Virginia reel. When the dance brought them face to face, his smile sent her heart racing. "You're causing quite a stir," he murmured during a moment when they came together. "Half the town's talking about how you've transformed the school." "And the other half?" she asked, breathless from more than just the dancing. His eyes held hers. "The other half's wondering why Mitchell Logan can't seem to take his eyes off the new schoolteacher." Before she could respond, the dance separated them again, sending her down the line to another partner. When she returned to Mitchell, her cheeks were flushed with more than exertion. "Am I that obvious?" he asked quietly as they circled each other. "Only to me, I think," she assured him, though she'd noticed the speculative glances from several of the town's women. As the music ended, Mitchell kept hold of her hand a moment longer than necessary. "Walk with me." They strolled away from the festivities toward the edge of town, where the vast Wyoming sky stretched above them, painted with the pinks and golds of sunset. "Billy asked me something yesterday," Mitchell said after they'd walked in comfortable silence for several minutes. "Something I've been thinking about too." Grace looked up at him questioningly. "He asked if you might come live with us someday." Mitchell's voice was careful, neutral. "Said it would be nice to have you there all the time, not just visiting." Grace's heart pounded in her chest. "And what did you tell him?" Mitchell stopped walking and turned to face her. "I told him that's not a question for a 6-year-old to be asking. that things between grown folks are complicated. Are they complicated? Grace found herself asking, surprised by her own boldness. Mitchell's gaze was steady on hers. They can be, especially when one of those folks has a past they're running from. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. What do you mean? His expression softened. Grace, I may be just a rancher now, but I wasn't always. I recognize when someone's starting over, trying to leave something behind. Takes one to know one, I suppose. She looked away, her carefully constructed world suddenly feeling precarious. You don't know anything about my past. No, he agreed quietly. And I don't need to unless you want to tell me. But whatever it is, it doesn't change what I see now, a kind, intelligent woman who's brought light back to this town, back to my son, back to me. Grace felt tears threatening and blinked them away. Mitchell, you don't have to say anything, he interrupted gently. I just wanted you to know that whatever you're running from, you found people here who care about you, one in particular who's starting to care a great deal. The honesty in his blue eyes undid her. Without thinking, Grace reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the scar along his jawline. Mitchell caught her hand in his and pressed a kiss to her palm, sending a shiver through her entire body. We should get back, she whispered, suddenly aware of how far they'd wandered from the town square. Mitchell nodded, but made no move to release her hand as they turned back toward the festivities. They walked in silence, both acutely aware of the shift that had just occurred between them. As November arrived with biting winds and the threat of snow, life in Winnetka settled into a rhythm dictated by the approaching winter. Ranchers like Mitchell focused on preparing their herds and homesteads for the harsh months ahead, while townspeople laid in supplies and reinforced buildings against the coming storms. At school, Grace introduced a Thanksgiving pageant to showcase the students' progress to their parents. Billy was cast as a pilgrim leader, a role he took with utmost seriousness, practicing his 3 lines relentlessly at home according to an amused Mitchell. He's driving the ranch hands crazy, declaiming about bountiful harvests while they're trying to mend fences. Mitchell told Grace one Sunday as they watched Billy demonstrate his performance for what must have been the 100th time. He's going to be wonderful, Grace assured him, enjoying the way Mitchell's eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. Their relationship had evolved into something neither of them had put a name to, yet deeper than friendship, but cautious in its progression. Mitchell had taken to walking her home from school on the days he came to town for supplies, their conversations ranging from books they'd both read to their differing experiences of the world. Grace found herself sharing more of her life in Philadelphia than she'd intended, though she carefully avoided any mention of Jonathan or the scandal that had driven her west. On a particularly cold afternoon a week before Thanksgiving, Grace dismissed her students early as heavy snow began to fall. Most of the children had anticipated the weather and came prepared with extra layers or arrangements to stay in town with friends if the storm worsened. Billy, however, was supposed to be picked up by one of the ranch hands who had yet to arrive. As the last of the other students departed, Grace found herself alone with an increasingly anxious Billy as the snow fell more heavily outside. Perhaps your father was delayed by the weather, she suggested, stoking the stove to keep the schoolhouse warm. We'll wait a bit longer before deciding what to do. Billy nodded, but his usual chatter had subsided, replaced by worried glances toward the window. An hour passed, then another, with no sign of anyone from the Circle L. Miss Fairfield, Billy finally said in a small voice, what if something bad happened? Grace knelt beside him, meeting his worried eyes. Your father is the most capable man I know. If he or the ranch hands haven't come, it's because they're being sensible about the weather. not because anything bad has happened. As if summoned by her words, the schoolhouse door burst open, bringing with it a flurry of snow and Mitchell Logan himself, snow-covered and red-cheeked from the cold. "Pa!" Billy launched himself across the room. Mitchell caught his son in a tight embrace. "Sorry I'm late, buddy." Storm came in faster than we expected. He looked over Billy's head at Grace. "Thank you for keeping him safe." "Of course." She took in Mitchell's appearance with concern. "You look half frozen." "Rode as fast as I dared once I realized Hank hadn't made it to town to get Billy." He set his son down, stamping snow from his boots. "Roads are drifting badly already. Won't be safe to try making it back to the ranch tonight." Grace nodded, having suspected as much from the intensity of the storm. "What will you do?" Mitchell hesitated, then said, "Mayor's offered rooms at the hotel for folks stranded in town. Billy and I can stay there." "Or," Grace found herself saying before she'd fully thought it through, "you could stay at my cabin. It's small, but there's the sofa for you and Billy could take my bed. I have extra blankets." The surprise in Mitchell's eyes was quickly replaced by something warmer. "Are you sure? Don't want to impose." "I'm sure," Grace said, surprised to find she meant it completely. "It makes the most sense, rather than trudging through all this snow to the hotel." And so it was decided. They gathered their things and made their way through the blizzard to Grace's small cabin, heads bent against the driving snow. Inside, Grace quickly built up the fire while Mitchell helped Billy out of his wet outer clothes. "I'm hungry," Billy announced once he was settled in a blanket by the fire. Grace smiled. "Let me see what I can find." Together, they cobbled together a simple but satisfying meal of beans, bacon, and the last of Grace's bread. As they ate around her small table, Grace was struck by how natural it felt, the three of them together in the cozy cabin while the storm raged outside. After dinner, Billy's eyelids began to droop, despite his protests that he wasn't tired. Grace prepared her bed for him, adding extra quilts against the growing chill. "Would you like a story?" she asked as he snuggled into the unfamiliar bed. Billy nodded sleepily. "The one about the knight and the dragon, please." As Grace settled beside him and began to read, she was aware of Mitchell watching from the doorway, his expression soft in the lamplight. By the third page, Billy was sound asleep. Grace carefully rose and joined Mitchell in the main room, where he stood warming his hands by the fire. Outside, the wind howled around the corners of the cabin, making the sturdy little structure creak and groan. "He'll sleep through anything," Mitchell commented. "Once he's out, not even a herd of stampeding cattle could wake him." "A useful trait on a ranch, I imagine," Grace replied, suddenly aware of their solitude. Mitchell turned to face her, the firelight casting his features in gold. "Grace, I want to thank you, not just for tonight, but for everything you've done for Billy. For us." "You don't need to thank me," she said softly. "Having you both in my life has been a gift I never expected." Something in his expression shifted, became more intense. "When Sarah died, I thought that was it for me. Figured I'd raise Billy alone and that would be my life. Didn't expect to ever feel this way again." Grace's heart thundered in her chest. "What way?" Mitchell took a step toward her. "Like I can't imagine my days without seeing you. Like everything is brighter when you're near. Like I want to build a future that has you in it every day." "Mitchell," she whispered, his name a prayer on her lips. He reached for her slowly, as if giving her time to retreat if she wished. When she didn't move away, his hands came to rest gently on her shoulders. "I'm falling in love with you, Grace Fairfield. Have been since that first day in the hotel dining room." The words she'd both longed for and feared hung in the air between them. Grace knew she should pull away, remind herself of all the reasons she'd come west alone, all the reasons she'd sworn never to trust her heart to a man again. Instead, she found herself stepping closer. "I've been fighting this," she admitted, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Trying not to feel what I feel for you, for Billy." "Why fight it?" he asked, one hand moving to cup her cheek. The truth trembled on her lips. "Because I came here to escape, not to find love. Because I'm afraid to trust again." Mitchell's thumb brushed gently across her cheekbone. "Whatever happened before, whoever hurt you, that's the past. This, right here, is what's real now." And then he was kissing her, his lips warm and certain against hers. Grace felt something inside her break free as she responded, her arms sliding around his neck as the kiss deepened. All her carefully constructed barriers fell away as Mitchell pulled her closer, his embrace both gentle and urgently needing. When they finally parted, both breathless, Mitchell rested his forehead against hers. "Been wanting to do that for a long time," he murmured. "Me too," she confessed, surprised by her own honesty. They moved to the sofa, where Mitchell kept his arm around her as the fire burned low. Grace found herself telling him about Jonathan, then the man she'd been engaged to in Philadelphia, whose betrayal with her closest friend had become scandalous fodder for society gossip. "He told everyone I'd broken the engagement, that I was unstable," she said, the old pain dimmed now in the warmth of Mitchell's presence. "My reputation was ruined. Teaching positions dried up. Coming west seemed the only option." Mitchell's arm tightened around her. "Man sounds like a fool who didn't know what he had." "It was for the best," Grace said, surprised to find she truly believed it now. "If not for that, I would never have come to Winnetka, never have met you and Billy." Mitchell tilted her face up to his. "Then I suppose I owe this Jonathan fellow a debt of gratitude, though I'd still like to introduce his face to my fist if we ever crossed paths." Grace laughed softly. "My gallant defender." "Always," he promised, before kissing her again. They talked long into the night, sharing pieces of themselves they'd kept hidden. Mitchell spoke of his wife more openly than before, her quick laugh, her love of music, how she'd made him promise to live fully after she was gone. "She would have liked you," he said, his voice gentle in the darkened room. "Would have approved of you being in Billy's life. In mine." As the fire burned down to embers, Grace reluctantly prepared the sofa for Mitchell to sleep on, adding extra blankets against the intensifying cold. "Try to get some rest," she told him, reluctant to end their time together but aware of propriety even in these unusual circumstances. Mitchell caught her hand as she turned to go. "Grace," he said simply, then seemed at a loss for words. Instead, he raised her fingers to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that conveyed more than words could have. She slept fitfully, aware of Mitchell's presence just beyond her bedroom door. The storm continued through the night, wrapping the cabin in a cocoon of white isolation that made their small sanctuary feel removed from the rest of the world. Morning brought weak sunlight and a transformed landscape. Snow had drifted against the cabin, reaching nearly to the windowsills in places. Grace awoke to the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet conversation from her small kitchen. "Be real quiet, Pa," she heard Billy Stage whisper. "Miss Fairfield's still sleeping." "Too late," Grace said, emerging from the bedroom in her robe, hair loose around her shoulders. "Something smells wonderful." Mitchell turned from the stove, his eyes warming at the sight of her. "Found your pantry. Hope you don't mind. Thought the least I could do was make breakfast." "Not at all." She was acutely aware of her informal appearance but found she didn't care as Mitchell's gaze lingered appreciatively. "Miss Fairfield, it snowed so much," Billy exclaimed, pointing to the window where snow had drifted halfway up the glass. "Pa says we might be stuck here another day." Grace looked to Mitchell questioningly. "Snow's too deep for horses right now," he confirmed. "Town will need to dig out some before we can head back to the ranch. "If that's all right with you," he added, suddenly unsure. "More than all right," she assured him. "I can't think of better company to be snowed in with." The day passed in a comfortable domesticity that felt both novel and somehow familiar. They played card games, read stories, and Mitchell even showed Grace how to whittle, guiding her hands as she created a lopsided but recognizable bird figure. Billy reveled in having both adults' undivided attention, bringing out toys he'd stashed in his school bag and creating elaborate stories about them. By late afternoon, men from town had begun clearing paths between buildings. The mayor himself came to check on Grace, looking only mildly surprised to find Mitchell and Billy there. "Roads should be passable by tomorrow," he informed them after declining Grace's offer of coffee. "Just wanted to make sure you were managing all right, Miss Fairfield." "We're perfectly fine, thank you," she replied, aware of Mitchell standing supportively nearby. After the mayor left, Mitchell approached her with a serious expression. "Grace, I need to say something about what happens when we return to normal life." Her heart stuttered with sudden anxiety. "Yes. I meant everything I said last night, every word." His eyes held hers steadily. "But I also respect your position in this community. I won't do anything to compromise that." Understanding dawned. "You mean you're worried about gossip?" He nodded. "Small towns talk. Don't want to give them reason to speak ill of you." Grace felt a rush of affection for this man who consistently put others before himself. "Mitchell, I appreciate your concern, but I've survived scandal before. I can handle a few wagging tongues." "Still," he persisted, "we should be mindful. Take things slow in public at least." She stepped closer, resting her hands on his chest. "And in private," his arms encircled her waist, pulling her gently against him. "In private, I plan to court you properly, Grace Fairfield, if you'll allow it." "I think that could be arranged," she murmured before rising on tiptoe to kiss him. A small cough from across the room reminded them they weren't alone. Billy stood watching them, his expression a mixture of curiosity and something like hope. "Pa," he said hesitantly, "are you kissing Miss Fairfield like in those books where the prince kisses the princess?" Mitchell looked momentarily flustered, but Grace smiled and beckoned the boy closer. "Your father and I care about each other very much, Billy," she explained, kneeling to his level. "And yes, sometimes when grown-ups care about each other that way, they show it with a kiss." Billy nodded solemnly. "Does that mean you're going to be around more? Like all the time, maybe?" Grace looked up at Mitchell, who was watching them with an expression that made her heart skip. "Would you like that?" she asked Billy carefully. "Yes." The boy's face lit up. "I told Pa after the first time you came for dinner that you should stay forever. He said it wasn't that simple, but I think it is." "Oh, you do you?" Mitchell asked, ruffling his son's hair. "And why's that?" Billy looked between them as if the answer was obvious. "Because we're happier when Miss Fairfield is here, and she looks happier with us too." That seems pretty simple to me. Out of the mouths of babes, Grace thought, deeply touched by the child's straightforward assessment. "Well, we're going to take things one step at a time," she told him gently. "But I promise I'll be around plenty." This seemed to satisfy Billy, who promptly changed the subject to whether they might have pie for supper, leaving the adults to exchange amused, tender glances over his head. The next day brought clear skies and the inevitable return to normal life. Mitchell and Billy departed for the ranch after breakfast, but not before Mitchell pulled Grace aside for a private moment. "I'll be in town on Wednesday for supplies," he told her, his hands warm on her shoulders. "Thought I might call on you properly that evening if you're amenable." "Very amenable," she assured him, savoring their last moments alone before facing the outside world. His kiss was gentle but filled with promise. "Until Wednesday, then." Grace watched them ride away. Billy waving enthusiastically from atop his pony until they disappeared around a bend in the road. She touched her lips, still warm from Mitchell's kiss, and allowed herself to believe that perhaps life had brought her to Winnetka for reasons far greater than escape. Word traveled quickly in small towns, and Winnetka was no exception. By Wednesday, Grace had endured knowing looks from Mrs. Henderson at the general store, an overly casual inquiry from Alma at the hotel about how things were going with Mitchell Logan, and several parents who suddenly found reasons to linger after collecting their children from school. None of it bothered her as much as she might have expected. There was a difference, she discovered, between malicious gossip intended to harm and the benign speculation of a community that generally wished her well. When Mitchell arrived at her cabin Wednesday evening, he came bearing a small bouquet of late-season wildflowers clearly gathered with care. "They're lovely," Grace said, arranging them in a jar on her table. "Thank you." "Billy helped pick them," Mitchell admitted with a smile. "He's quite invested in my courting you properly, gave me all sorts of advice." Grace laughed, picturing the serious 6-year-old counseling his father on matters of the heart. "And what pearls of wisdom did he share? That I should brush my hair and not talk about cattle prices, primarily." Mitchell's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Also that I should tell you you're pretty, which is no hardship at all since you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen." The simple sincerity in his voice made Grace blush. Their courtship proceeded with a sweetness that helped heal the scars left by Jonathan's betrayal. Mitchell called on her regularly, sometimes with Billy in tow, sometimes alone for quiet evenings by the fire where conversation flowed easily, and their kisses grew increasingly passionate. As Thanksgiving approached, Mitchell surprised her by inviting her to join them for the holiday at the ranch, along with his sister Rebecca, who was visiting from Denver. "I'd like her to meet you," he explained. "She's the only family Billy and I have left." The invitation felt significant, a step toward something more permanent. "I'd be honored," Grace told him, touched by his desire to include her in his family gathering. Rebecca Logan Mason arrived the day before Thanksgiving, a tall, handsome woman with her brother's blue eyes and direct manner. She observed Grace carefully during their first meeting after church, but by the time they were all seated around the Thanksgiving table at the ranch, her initial reserve had melted into obvious approval. "My brother hasn't looked this happy in years," Rebecca confided to Grace as they washed dishes together while the men tended to necessary ranch chores. "And Billy adores you. It does my heart good to see them both thriving." "They mean a great deal to me," Grace admitted. "More than I ever expected." Rebecca's shrewd eyes assessed her. "Enough to consider making a life here permanently, because I should warn you, my brother isn't one for temporary attachments." Grace met her gaze steadily. "I came to Winnetka thinking it might be just another stop on a longer journey. Now, I can't imagine being anywhere else." This seemed to satisfy Rebecca, who nodded approvingly before changing the subject to Grace's plans for the school's Christmas pageant. The following Sunday after church, Mitchell suggested a ride to show Grace some of the more distant parts of his property. The day was cold but clear, the snow-covered landscape glittering under bright sunshine. "There's something particular I'd like to show you," he said cryptically as they rode side by side, their breath clouding in the winter air. He led her to a rise overlooking a sheltered valley where a half-built structure stood, the beginnings of a house. "What's this?" Grace asked, curious about the foundation and partially framed walls. Mitchell dismounted and helped her down from her horse before answering. "Started it last spring. Thought Billy and I might need more room eventually." He looked at her intently. "Been working on it whenever I can spare time from regular ranch business." Grace walked toward the structure, noting the care evident in even its unfinished state. "It's going to be beautiful. That's the hope." Mitchell came to stand beside her. "Grace, there's something I need to ask you." Her heart began to race as he took her gloved hands in his. "These past months, knowing you have been the happiest I've had since before Sarah died. You've brought light back into my life, into Billy's life." His voice was steady but filled with emotion. "I know it hasn't been long, but sometimes when something's right, you just know it." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "This was my mother's," he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond. "Nothing fancy, but given with all my heart." Grace felt tears forming despite her best efforts to contain them. "Grace Fairfield, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife, of being a mother to Billy and building a life with us here?" "Yes," she whispered without hesitation. "Yes, Mitchell, I would love nothing more." His face broke into a smile of such joy that it took her breath away. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms for a kiss that promised a lifetime of happiness, Grace knew with absolute certainty that this was where she belonged. They agreed to marry after the school year ended in May, giving them time to finish the new house and make proper arrangements. Billy, when told of their engagement that evening, reacted with characteristic enthusiasm. "I knew it," he crowed, dancing around the kitchen. "I knew you were going to be my new mama." Grace knelt to embrace him, her heart full. "Is that all right with you, if I become your new mother?" Billy's expression grew serious as he pulled back to look at her. "Can I ask you something first?" "Anything," she assured him. "Can you be my mama?" He asked solemnly, his blue eyes so like his father's, wide and vulnerable. "For real? Not just because you're marrying Pa?" Grace felt tears spill onto her cheeks as she pulled him close again. "Oh, Billy," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "I would be honored to be your mama. For real. With all my heart." Over Billy's head, her eyes met Mitchell's, seeing in them the same love and certainty that filled her own heart. In that moment, she knew that the journey that had begun in pain and uncertainty had led her exactly where she was meant to be, to this man, this child, this life they would build together. The winter passed in a flurry of wedding preparations and continued work on the new house whenever weather permitted. Grace found herself embraced by the community, with women offering advice, recipes, and handmade gifts for her new home. The school thrived under her care, with even the most difficult students showing remarkable improvement. By early May, as the Wyoming landscape burst into spring bloom, the new house stood complete, a spacious two-story home with large windows to capture the stunning views, built with love by Mitchell's hands with help from friends and neighbors. They were married on the last Saturday in May 1877, in the small white church where they had first locked eyes across the pews. Billy stood proudly at his father's side as best man, carefully guarding the rings until the moment they were needed. When Grace, radiant in a simple white gown made by the town's seamstress, walked down the aisle to join Mitchell, she felt none of the doubts that had plagued her during her previous engagement. This was right. This was where she belonged. "I promise to love you faithfully, to honor and respect you, to stand by you in joy and in sorrow," Mitchell vowed, his voice steady and sure. "To build a life and a family with you, to cherish you all the days of my life." Grace's own vows included promises not only to Mitchell, but to Billy as well, to nurture, guide, and love him as her own. There wasn't a dry eye in the church when, after the traditional vows were exchanged, Mitchell knelt to Billy's level and Grace joined him. "Today we become a family," Mitchell said to his son, his voice thick with emotion. "The three of us bound together by love." Billy, solemn in his new suit, looked from his father to Grace. Forever, forever, Grace confirmed, opening her arms to him. The boy stepped into their embrace, and for a moment, the three of them held each other while the congregation looked on, many wiping away tears at the poignant moment. The celebration afterward was joyous, a community gathering with music, dancing, and enough food to feed half the territory. Grace and Mitchell moved among their guests hand in hand, accepting congratulations and well wishes. Rebecca, who had returned for the wedding, pulled Grace aside at one point. "Welcome to the family, sister," she said warmly. "I've never seen Mitchell so happy, or Billy for that matter." "They make me happier than I ever thought possible," Grace admitted. "Sometimes I still can't believe how fortunate I am." Rebecca squeezed her hand. "It's not fortune, it's what you all deserve." As the evening wound down, Mitchell and Grace prepared to depart for their new home, where they would spend their first night as husband and wife. Billy would stay with friends in town for 2 nights before joining them, giving the newlyweds a brief honeymoon. "Ready, Mrs. Logan?" Mitchell asked softly, helping her into the wagon decorated with ribbons and flowers by well-meaning townspeople. "More than ready, Mr. Logan," she replied, her heart full to bursting as they drove away amid cheers and good wishes. Their wedding night was everything Grace had dreamed it might be: tender, passionate, and filled with the kind of love she had once thought existed only in novels. Mitchell's hands and lips were gentle yet insistent, guiding her through the initial awkwardness into pleasure she had never imagined possible. Afterward, lying in his arms in their new bedroom, she felt truly at peace for the first time in years. "Happy," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Completely," she assured him, trailing her fingers across his chest. "I love you so much, Mitchell Logan." "And I love you, Grace Logan," he replied, the new name sending a thrill through her. "Always will till my last breath and beyond." 2 days later, Billy joined them at the new house, his excitement at their new family arrangement infectious. Grace had prepared his room with special care, including a new bookshelf filled with favorites from her personal collection, and a quilt made by the women of Winnetka as a wedding gift. "This is really our house now, all of us together?" Billy asked as they showed him around. "Really and truly," Mitchell confirmed, his arm around Grace's waist. "What do you think?" Billy surveyed the home thoughtfully, then looked up at Grace. "I think it's perfect. Especially since you're here now, for always." That night, as they tucked Billy into his new bed, he asked for an extra long story. Grace obliged, reading until his eyelids grew heavy. As she closed the book, Billy reached for her hand. "I'm really glad you're my mama now," he said sleepily. Grace's throat tightened with emotion. "So am I, sweetheart, more than I can say." Later, as she and Mitchell prepared for bed themselves, she told him about the moment. "He called me mama so naturally, as if he's been saying it forever." Mitchell pulled her close. "He's been waiting to say it since the day he met you, I think. Just needed to know it was allowed." As spring turned to summer, their new life settled into happy rhythms. Grace continued teaching, though she now rode to and from town with Mitchell or one of the ranch hands. The school term ended in late June, giving her the summer to fully adjust to life as a rancher's wife. She took to it with surprising ease, learning to manage the household, tend the kitchen garden, and even help with some of the lighter ranch work. By late July, she had news that added to their happiness. "Mitchell," she said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, "I have something to tell you." He turned to her, concern in his eyes at her serious tone. "Everything all right?" Grace took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "Everything is wonderful. We're going to have a baby." The joy that spread across his face was answer enough, but his words confirmed it. "A baby, you're sure?" she nodded, smiling through happy tears. "Doctor." Wilson confirmed it yesterday when I was in town. He thinks the baby will come in February. Mitchell gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of precious glass. Grace Logan, you continue to make me the happiest man alive. They told Billy the next day, uncertain how he would react to the news of a sibling. His response surprised and touched them both. "Does that mean I'll be a big brother?" he asked, his eyes wide. "That's exactly what it means," Mitchell confirmed. "What do you think about that?" Billy considered for a moment. "I think it's good. The baby will need someone to teach it things like how to ride a horse and count cattle." "And read stories," Grace added, relieved at his acceptance. "Yeah," Billy agreed enthusiastically. "I can read to it from my books, the ones you taught me with." As summer faded into autumn, Grace's condition became more noticeable. The community embraced the news, with women offering advice and baby clothes saved from their own children. Mitchell became increasingly protective, insisting on accompanying her to and from school and enlisting help with household tasks he deemed too strenuous. "I'm pregnant, Mitchell, not made of china." Grace protested one evening when he tried to prevent her from carrying a basket of laundry. "Humor me," he replied, taking the basket from her hands. "Let me take care of you the way you take care of everyone else." It was impossible to argue with the love in his eyes, so Grace acquiesced, secretly touched by his concern. As the baby grew within her, so did her love for the life they were building together. Christmas that year was especially joyful. They decorated the house with pine boughs and berries, and Mitchell surprised Grace with a beautiful cradle he had crafted himself from ranch timber. "It's exquisite," she breathed, running her hands over the smooth wood. "Our baby will love it." "Our baby will be loved," he corrected gently, his hand covering hers over her rounded belly. "Just as you are, just as Billy is." New Year 1878 arrived with a blizzard that isolated the ranch for nearly a week. They spent the time playing games with Billy, reading by the fire, and planning for the baby's arrival. Grace continued to feel well despite her advancing pregnancy, though she had reluctantly turned over her teaching duties to a substitute for the remainder of the term. February brought milder weather and increasing anticipation. Mitchell rarely left the ranch now, unwilling to be far from Grace as her time approached. Billy asked daily if the baby was coming yet, his excitement growing with each passing day. On the morning of February 17, Grace awoke to the first unmistakable pains. "Mitchell," she said, touching his sleeping face, "I think it's time." The next 12 hours passed in a blur of pain, effort, and finally, the miraculous sound of their child's first cry. "A boy," the midwife announced, placing the red-faced, squalling infant on Grace's chest. "A fine, strong boy." Mitchell, who had refused to leave her side throughout the ordeal, leaned down to kiss her sweat-dampened forehead, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "He's perfect," he whispered. "You're perfect. I love you so much." They named him Samuel James Logan, Samuel after Mitchell's father, James after Grace's. When Billy was finally allowed in to meet his new brother, his awe was palpable. "He's so small," he whispered, peering at the infant in Grace's arms. "But he's got Pa's nose, I think." "And your mama's chin," Mitchell added, his arm around Billy's shoulders. "What do you think, son? Good addition to the family," Billy nodded solemnly. "I'm going to be the best big brother ever, I promise." As Grace watched her two boys 1-6, one newborn, she felt her heart might burst with happiness. When Mitchell sat beside her on the bed, drawing all three of them into his embrace, she knew with absolute certainty that the journey that had begun with her desperate flight from Philadelphia had led her exactly where she needed to be. "My boys," she murmured, looking from Billy to Samuel to Mitchell. "My family." "Forever," Mitchell promised, echoing the word Billy had used on their wedding day. "This is just the beginning, Grace, just the beginning of forever." And it was. Over the years that followed, the Logan family thrived. Grace eventually returned to teaching, but only part-time, finding her greatest joy in raising her growing family. Samuel was joined by a sister, Sarah Rebecca, 2 years later, and another brother, Michael, 2 years after that. Billy grew into a fine young man, as dedicated to ranching as his father, but with his stepmother's love of books and learning. He never forgot that winter day when Grace had first agreed to be his mama, often telling the story to his younger siblings as an example of how families could be created through love as much as blood. The Circle L Ranch prospered under Mitchell and Grace's stewardship, eventually becoming one of the most respected spreads in the territory. They weathered hard winters, drought seasons, and the normal trials of ranch life with the same strength and unity they brought to everything. On their 20th anniversary, Mitchell took Grace back to the church where they had married. As they stood in the quiet sanctuary, he took her hands in his, just as he had on their wedding day. "20 years ago, I promised to love you all the days of my life," he said, his voice deeper with age but still strong. "That promise has been the easiest one I've ever kept." Grace, her auburn hair now threaded with silver but her eyes as bright as ever, smiled up at the man who had healed her heart and given her a life beyond her wildest dreams. "And I have loved being your wife, Mitchell Logan, the mother of your children, the keeper of your heart." As they walked home arm in arm through the streets of Winnetka, now a proper town of over 1,000 souls, Grace thought of that frightened young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 20 years before, seeking only escape and anonymity. How could she have known that she would find instead the greatest love, the most beautiful family, the richest life she could imagine? "What are you thinking about?" Mitchell asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "About beginnings," she replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "And how the hardest journeys sometimes lead to the most perfect destinations." He squeezed her hand in understanding. "Welcome home, Grace Logan," he said softly. "Welcome home."